My name is Daryl Edwards, and I am very pleased here at the Faculty of Music to be welcoming you to this Ovid Symposium and presentation of the premiere of Norbert Palej's opera, The Art of Love. We will be recording this, so I will encourage you to turn your mics off and your cameras off if you want. When it's time, after 20 minutes of each of our 4 presentations, for you to ask questions if you like, please turn your mics back on and your video back on if you so choose. I would like to also give a land acknowledgement, because we wish to acknowledge that this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We will be beginning our first of 4 presentations about Ovid with Professor Maria Pietropalo. She is the Associate Professor in the Department of Classics at McMaster University, and her main research interests are in the areas of Latin poetry and aesthetics. Her recent research has been focused on the grotesque in Roman elegy and on the aesthetics of Ars Amatoria. She is very pleased to be part of this symposium. Oh, I'm so glad, Professor Pietrangelo. And speaking about the art of Ovid's Art of Love in the context of the culture of his time. Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction and for the kind invitation to speak at the symposium today. Since I'm the first speaker on the program, I thought maybe I should begin with a couple of references to Ovid's life. He was born in Sulmona in 43 BCE, and he died in Pontus around 17 CE. He lived most of his adult life during the reign of Augustus, which lasted from approximately 31 BCE to 14 CE. And Ovid was a prolific writer in a variety of genres, and he achieved enduring fame with his works in Rome and beyond. His didactic works, the Ars Amatoria, Remedia Amoris, and Medicamina, or the Art of Love, the Cure for Love, and the small poem on facial cosmetics, are generally agreed to have appeared between 2 BCE and 2 CE. His epic, The Metamorphoses, is perhaps his most distinguished work, but his Art of Love is his most notorious. So, the Art of Love. Ovid's famous and infamous Art of Love is, among other things, a poem in 3 books on how to start and conduct successful love affairs. The first book offers men instruction on how to get a suitable beloved, the second on how to retain her affection, and the third on how women can seduce men while appearing to be the ones seduced. In the narrative fiction of the poem, the achievement of success in such amorous pursuits requires mastery of the art of securing lovers and a clear understanding of the ideal of personal refinement that provokes desire and admiration, designated in classical Latin respectively by the words ars and cultus. In classical antiquity, the word ars, art, skill, technique, was applicable to all manner of activities, in all of which its application was meant to achieve a form of excellence and enhanced appearance. This is the skill you need for artistic composition, as well as the skill you need to be cunning in social relations. In the title of Ovid's poem, the Ars Amatoria, it ostensibly refers to the skill of successful lovers, but it can also be taken as a reference to the skill of the poet writing about love. The same thing is true of the level of cultivated refinement that the poet and the lover intend to achieve in their respective activities. At the core of cultivated excellence is cultus, an ideal of contemporary Roman culture that concerns not only enhanced female appearance and behavior, but polish and technical perfection in all purposeful activities. Ars and cultus mark the way towards the achievement of such purposes. The Ars Amatoria deals with various aspects of love in elegiac couplets, that is to say, in the meter of love poetry, and in the didactic mode, in the context of Augustan culture and against the background of the elegiac tradition, a tradition of love poetry centered on a lover who is also a poet of the same genre and on his pining for a beloved. The art of love intersects the two poetic genres, the didactic and the elegiac genre, with respect to both form and content. A basic convention of the didactic form is that it must cast its readers as learners seeking to equip themselves with knowledge and skills they need in order to achieve success in a given field of activity. Such knowledge and skills are presumed to exist in the body of works that belong to that field in contemporary culture, embodiments of knowledge with which students of the subject must become familiar, with the aid of a compendium of the principles and rules that its attainment presupposes. The areas contemplated by didactic poetry included fields such as philosophy, farming, hunting, not usually love, although in the non-didactic tradition, we frequently meet a woman of worldly experience and knowledge imparting advice on love. In love elegy, the instruction in successful erotic relations is a frequent theme. And the narrative convention is that it is normally provided in the form of personal advice to the young beloved pursued by the poet by an older, experienced woman, usually a procuress. In bringing together the two genres, Ovid imagines a male fictional teacher who believes that the art of successful erotic relations can indeed be taught and is a serious enough subject to deserve a lengthy treatment. Ovid gives himself the task of writing such an erotodidactic poem, though unlike the persona of the teacher, he does so in a tongue-in-cheek manner, as an exercise in literary cleverness, designed to debunk the didactic genre by raising the status of love to that of a teachable subject, and by frivolously reducing the overwhelming passion of elegiac poets and lovers to the principles and rules of a game of wooing, a drama where everyone has a role to play. By offering the art of love as a subject of instruction within the framework of didactic poetry, Ovid presents love as a cultural phenomenon rather than a private emotional experience, and simultaneously points to the amatory literary tradition as a digest of conventions that the apprentices of the art of love must examine with care. We can say that the art of love is not concerned with love as such, but with the literary discourse on love, articulated as a set of conventions, chiefly in the corpus of Roman elegy and read in mock seriousness. In the fiction of its narrative, the art of love seeks to impart the knowledge necessary to manipulate those conventions, using mythological stories from antiquity to be interpreted against the background of contemporary culture. Therefore, while it ostensibly speaks of love, the art of love is actually a sustained exercise in reading, somewhat flippantly, the love literature that enjoyed currency in contemporary culture. It's conducted in response to the idea of erotic relations implicit in both the literary culture of his intended readers and the principles of public morality to which they were expected to adhere. The contact of the art of love with the real world of its intended readers is intimately related to its literary form. The readers are addressed directly. The first and second books of The Art of Love are addressed to men, while the third book is purportedly addressed to young women, but not Roman married ladies who already in book one have been asked to turn their eyes away from the poem. Though of course this is only a rhetorical gesture, signaling that the stately matrons were also perhaps among Ovid's intended readers. Reading is, of course, the activity of real people perusing Ovid's work, but it is also the activity of the fictional audience that exists within the frame of the story. The members of this internal audience are also meant to become acquainted with the corpus of texts in which the conventions of the art of love are presumed to be embodied. And there's an easy process of osmosis between the two audiences. The parallelism is a textual strategy designed to encourage Ovid's real audience outside the text to identify with their fictional counterpart in the text. So Ovid essentially brings his real audience into the fiction of the poem. The major implication of this poetic form, which is an integral part of the framework of didactic poems, is that the relationship between the work and the society in which it is meant to circulate is inscribed in the text itself. Such works may enjoy great success for centuries, as indeed the Ars Amatoria has been enjoying and continues to enjoy, but they were conceived in dialogue with their contemporary world. The dialogue is conducted ostensibly by the praeceptor, or the teacher of love in the text, but in reality and on a different plane, by the author. However, they're not to be confused as the same person. They're not exactly the same, despite having the same name, Naso. The speaker boldly calls himself the praeceptor amoris, the teacher of love, right at the very start of book 1. In interpreting the teaching that he imparts to his fictional audience, we must keep in mind that he is an equally fictional character, a persona distinct from the poet himself, though he has much in common with this poet and espouses similar aesthetics. A didactic poet is a teacher, an expert who can educate an audience in the field of his expertise. The praeceptor sets himself up as an expert in the art of love, and by implication, as an expert on love poetry. He is expert enough, he tells us, to be asked by Venus, the goddess of love herself, to guide or tutor her son, Amor, Cupid, love himself with a capital L, or love itself with a lowercase l. A part of Ovid's literary jest is that he can teach his pupils how to control the passion of love while the speaker himself controls Cupid. He can master the god of love. In the Ars Amatoria, in the art of love, love is understood as erotic relations of the kind codified in amatory poetry and is hence something that can be taught. For this teacher, love and seduction are skills that can be acquired, but teaching them takes a certain talent, one he is confident he possesses. The didactic teacher usually presents his topic and explains the technical aspects of it by examples, with which he expects his readers to be familiar. And examples and metaphors in the art of love come from the literary tradition, from epic, from drama, from didactic poetry, from history, mythology, and they're frequently couched in appropriately didactic references to hunting and fishing and daily life. That is, daily life in Augustus's Rome. The teacher leaves no doubt about this. He says the theaters, the porticos, the temples, the architectural monuments of Augustus's new Rome in which Augustus took so much pride, all of these are really great places for beginning or the consummation of, perhaps, love affairs. We can imagine Augustus being upset by such references, since these buildings were meant to be seen as an architectural proclamation of his vision of Rome. And central to this vision is the legislation governing public morality. The Julian laws of 18 BCE regulated marriage, remarriage, choice of partner, extramarital relations, and the like, with several penalties for infractions, including exile. Essentially, they moved the governance of sexual practices from the private realm of the family to the public realm of the state, which held it under the supervision of the courts. Adulterous relations were criminalized for all but prostitutes and their clients, and the sexual freedom, of married men and women of the upper class was severely restricted to marital relations. Marriage and having children were strongly encouraged and incentivized, to put it mildly. It has been remarked that in the text of the laws themselves, however, the legal definition of a matrona, or an upper class married Roman woman, wasn't exactly precise. And this may have given Ovid some leeway in his poems. In the third book of The Art of Love, he says he's addressing women who are allowed by the law to receive instruction in the art of erotic relations, suggesting perhaps that maybe even married women could be thought to belong in that category as well. There is, however, no evidence that Ovid consciously attempted to teach disregard for the laws governing the sexual behavior of society and that his work was intended to give lessons in adultery. Yet there's no doubt that the ethos generated by Ovid's poem clashed with the social practices promoted by Augustan policies, though perhaps not with the real social practices of Rome, which the Augustan laws sought to reform. But Ovid tells us, however, that in 8 CE, he was banished by Augustus to Tomis, the modern city of Constanza in Romania. In the ancient Roman province of Pontus, far from Rome, far from the glamorous and cosmopolitan center where poetry such as his could be appreciated. And he was famous at the height of his fame and his banishment, his moment of banishment. But out of sight isn't out of mind, or as one scholar says, nor is it out of ear, because in Tomis he continues to write. And in the Tristia, the sorrows or the sad songs, he says he was banished because of Carmen et error, a song and a mistake. He says he's got to keep silent about the nature of the mistake, which remains a mystery to this day. But he specifies that the song was the Art of Love. And this is because it was accused of encouraging adultery. Ovid lamented the fact that the poem had been removed from public libraries, and he hints that owning a copy had somehow become risky. He says this most explicitly in his letters from Pontus, in which he laments the shelf space that was previously occupied by the Art of Love is now vacant. And he does again in the Tristia, in the Sorrows, where he imagines that his poem, suitably personified, travels back to the capital instead of Ovid, only to discover that his brothers, Ovid's other books, were no longer where he expected them to be. And this poem itself is denied admittance to the temples of knowledge. Now, despite his attempts to defend his poetry and despite his pleas, Ovid was not allowed to return to Rome, and he died in Tomis at about 17 CE. Since they play such an important role in Act 2 of the opera, I'd like to say just a few words about the tales from Crete. At times, the teacher, the praeceptor amoris, lingers on or luxuriates in these mythological examples. He seems to break off from his advising in order to give a fleshed out account of a myth. Stories of Faciei, Ariadne, and Daedalus are all examples of this kind. The myths are related to each other in that Faciei and Ariadne are family, and Ariadne is the half-sister of the Minotaur. Faciei is her mother. Daedalus is the skilled artist on whom Faciei calls to fashion the wooden cow costume in which she enters in order to have sex with the bull after whom she lusts. But in the Art of Love, they are developed independently. And at first, they seem tangentially linked to the main narrative, that is, to the praeceptor's lessons on love. They don't necessarily arise naturally from the declared intent of his teaching. Rather, they have to be woven into it in an operation that requires considerable skill. In this operation, Ovid displays mastery of the ars, the art of poetical narration, while the praeceptor displays his teaching skill before his audience. He doesn't repeat the expected interpretations of the myths, but he twists them, he manipulates them to suit his agenda. Emphasis on art and poetic skill is also what links these mythological examples, none of which is an exact illustration of the wooing or practice of the art of love taught by the praeceptor. But all of them do show great skill in creating the scenario in which the protagonists can operate at their best. The story of Faciei, for example, comes up in the context of uncontrollable female desire, so ungovernable that when taken to extremes, it can even sink into bestiality. In pursuing the bull, she orchestrates her own narrative to fit that of the Ars Amatoria, turning her lust into an elegiac scenario of sorts by following the precepts of the art of wooing taught by elegiac poetry. Ovid hints that maybe she would have been more successful had she had a chance to read the whole of the Art of Love. Daedalus is the artist par excellence, displaying art skill that enables Faciei to break boundaries and that prompt him to cross formidable limitations of his own. In the story of Bacchus and Ariadne, the focus is not on Ariadne, but rather on Bacchus, the god of theater and expert in the art of choreography and staging. He gives form to a spectacle so grand that it completely overcomes Ariadne. he doesn't need a handbook on wooing. Each of these myths is presented as a narrative expansion of the art mastered by its central character. They all display such creativity that they invite the readers to see Ovid projecting his own poetic art, not only into the praeceptor's art of weaving into coherence apparently unrelated mythological examples, but also in the art displayed by the mythological characters themselves in creating an appropriate poetic space for their activities. The appreciation of art in all forms and at all stages of the creative process is central to the Ovidian aesthetic. We have a good sense of the art by which the beauty of women was created from the surviving portion of the Medicamina, which lists some truly repulsive cosmetics along with the blemishes in need of concealment. And we know that it takes great art to transform a list of disgusting details into poetry, and into poetry about beauty, no less. The art of applying cosmetics was an art of dissimulation, designed to draw attention to the final product while concealing the work leading to it, in the spirit of the principle that art is advantageous if it is hidden, as Ovid himself tells us. Yet, in artificial creations involving skill, the process is not absent from the awareness of one appreciating the beauty of the product. And here Ovid presents us with a sophisticated play of simulation and dissimulation. The girl who employs the poet's cosmetic arts to cover up her blemishes in both the Ars Amatoria and the Medicamina was created by his imagination with an awareness of her flaws and with the desire to conceal them in order to please men. In the art of her cosmetic self-enhancement, in other words, the poet shows us the blemishes and the mask, the process and the product. By explicitly pointing to the flaws that necessitate correction and concealment, Ovid simultaneously displays the skill and art required for this concealment, as well as the final polished results. On the metapoetic plane, this ensures that the reader admires both the poem and the skill that went into the process of crafting it. The reader is led to acknowledge and to enjoy the performance of a virtuoso. And this too is the art of Ovid's Art of Love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Pia. And now we can open this to any questions that you might have from the listeners. So please feel free to raise your hand and to turn on your microphone, and I'll be happy to have you ask your question of Maria Pia. Do we have any questions here?
Allison, please.
I can always ask a question about Ovid and the Ars. You concentrated very rightly so, really on the sculpting of the female and the females in the myths in Ovid's artistic rendition. I'm wondering if you see any cultivation in Ovid's cultus in book 3, or sorry, in books 1 and 2 with the men in how they need to shape themselves.
Sure. He does, talks about, how long your toga should be, how tight your toga should be, what your beard should be like, what you should smell like, what you should not smell like, right? In order to get the lover. And I think what he says about bodies kind of goes with what he says about poetry, right? Everything has to be kind of polished in just the right way, not over polished, not too showy, right? But at the same time, kind of set to an ideal, right? An ideal to become attractive, sort of in a moderation, right? In a moderation that is not, overblown and almost epic, right? Maybe it's tidier and elegiac in a way, so that the cultus isn't really ever separated from the art and craft, and the art and craft that you use in order to craft you as you play a role in this.
Thank you. But no one's ever going to be as good at it as Ovid, right?
So the teacher claims to be good, but he's not as good, right, as the poet behind it all. And even though the poet and the teacher, you can kind of slip from one to the other, or confuse them rather in your mind easily enough. He's a good teacher, but that doesn't mean that you're an excellent pupil, that you will get it, right? And that you'll be as good as he will be, and that you can, overtake the teacher after. I think he kind of secures himself a bold place at undefeatable right at the beginning. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Any other questions? I have a question about the application of cosmetics, and in our examination of the translation, there was a discrepancy amongst the singers about whether it meant beautifying or skin whitening. And some of the singers did not want to associate themselves with the production that involved skin whitening as some kind of a hierarchical beautification. Mm-hmm. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, I'm trying to remember exactly what the Latin is, but I know that a kind of, the word for radiance, for like a white radiant beauty, candida, is often used of the beloved in elegy, and that it frequently gets translated as radiance, but there is a kind of a sort of lightness attached to it. That doesn't necessarily mean skin lightening, but I can see how it can be interpreted that way as well. But if you're thinking of the kind of ideal of this beloved who does not and cannot ever really exist in the poetry anyhow, right? You almost can't quite imagine her or visualize her. You're only given sort of fragments, and one of them is not a description of her complexion, but a sort of this kind of I don't know, I don't want to say aura, but like a radiance, right? A general radiance, and so because that is candida, which also means white, I can see how this would lead itself to some lead interpreters to some interesting discussions.
Okay, that helps tremendously. Thank you very much.
Darcy.
Last call. Darcy.
There we go. So just following up on that, I wonder if, and I can't remember the specific bit of the Medicamina either, but just in terms of sort of hierarchies of aesthetics, it's less likely to be anything to do with innate skin tone, mm-hmm. and more to do with the distinctions between being out in the sun versus not having to be out in the sun. Yeah. So that if there's a question of actual skin tone, it's nothing to do with, say, race-based skin tone, and entirely to do with the servile versus the not servile.
Yes, if you are of the upper class and can stay inside and don't have to be outside in the sun, yeah, and then you, yes, you can have this kind of paler sort of complexion.
But that's, I mean, but that's only following up on what Maria Pia already said in terms of it by no means only, the word candidus by no means only having to do with skin tone or even whiteness necessarily.
Or even complexion. It's sort of a whole radiance, a whole kind of an awe, right, that it creates, that her complexion creates. And this is why she is so fictitious, and why even in book 3 or after they've read the Medicamina and smeared all the crocodile dung on their faces, right, you're never going to be one of those beautiful written women, right, the ones that are created, right, as art objects by this artist, right, in his poetry.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks, Darcy.
Okay, now we're going to proceed with Professor Alison Keith, who's going to speak about her connection of this with a novel. So Alison Keith is Professor of Classics and Women's Studies and Director of the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. She has devoted a long career at Toronto to the study of Ovid's poetry, and is thrilled to be making her debut in a JHI-sponsored event. by speaking about her favorite Latin poet and the reception of his Art of Love in an inexplicable story by the Czech Toronto novelist Josef Skaboretsky.
Thanks very much, Daryl. And I am indeed very thrilled to participate in a program for the arts event that's, centered in important ways on Ovid. I'm just going to try to share my screen because I have some slides. I think that has worked. You'll tell me if it hasn't. Super, thank you. So my talk today moves very fast forward from where Professor Pietro Paolo's left off to explore one very recent reception of Ovid's poem on the art of love in a late 20th century Czech novel whose title I can't pronounce, by the UTM English department's own Josef Skvoretsky. And this is kind of also a Canadian context for the current interest in Ovid's Art of Love in a different artistic form, the opera, that we will have a chance to hear about very soon. But just to show some interest in the Canadian or Toronto context in the ancient poet and the art of love. So the Czech novel was translated into English as An Inexplicable Story and published by Toronto's Key Porter Books in 2002. It addresses the dramatic transformation in Ovid's fortunes from the pinnacle of literary success to lonely exile as a result of his Art of Love, the poem that was one of the causes of his exile. Josef Skvoretsky mines Ovid's poetry not only for insight into the nature of art and love, but also for insight into the life of an exile. The Toronto-based Czech novelist put his wide knowledge of Roman history and his personal experience of political exile to the service of a fascinating postmodernist morality tale in this novel, presenting Ovid as an elusive figure, an enigma in this case to Ovid's nephew, Quintus Firmus Siculus, who follows the injunction encoded in his speaking name to take up a quest and to find his missing uncle, as he records in his diaries the work that he conducts on a strange new engine for ships. And I should just say that there's a lot of Icaran thematics and imagery in the novel, which also plays off of the Daedalus and Icarus myth that Ovid treats in the Ars Amatoria, as well as in the Metamorphoses. Now, the novel combines the genres of Bildungsroman, mystery narrative, travel narrative, and academic satire. Formerly indebted to Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket and Nabokov's Pale Fire, it presents Quest's quest in the form of an embedded narrative. This is the narratio questi, presented as a translation of what can still be read of the Latin, deciphered from a papyrus scroll hidden in an urn and sealed in the wall of an ancient tomb in the Honduras. It's in fact, the burial chamber of the Mayan king. The memento mori confuses the archaeologist because the Latin scroll is older than the 1600-year-old tomb itself. So the narratio questi is accompanied by a masterful and hilarious commentary by the mystery writer, Patrick Oliver Enfield, who signs his commentaries with his initials, Poe, to assist those uninformed about ancient Rome. The results are both highly pretentious, like much academic writing, and unintentionally funny, again, perhaps like much academic writing. To give you a taste of the narratio questi, I reproduce on my next slide the opening fragment of the papyrus scroll as presented by Poe. So fragment 1, consulate 1, Firmus Siculus. And then we have our first footnote. The footnote goes on for 2.5 pages. And I'm just going to read a bit of what's on the slide. This is in the footnote. We discover further on in the text that this man is Questus' father and that his given name is Gaius. In the Republic, a 3-name system was used, and it prevailed into the empire until finally utter confusion resulted. The use of 3 names remained the rule, but as a result of adoption, the splitting of original families, the loss of the original significance of the surname, or the awarding of a special honor, blah, 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 blah. So I won't read the rest of it, but it is quite funny. And Sforzeschi plays around throughout with his knowledge of Latin and punning on Latin names, obviously, as we have in Questus' own name. So I skip over the rest of the first paragraph of the note, which, as I say, covers another page and a half of the text, to get to the part that signals Sforzeschi's playful approach to the narrative. Still on the topic of names, it's interesting to note the praenomen of the narrator, Questus. Unlike our era, when a myriad of first names are in broad use, in the earliest times, the number of common praenomina was smaller than 30. By the middle of the 1st century BC, this list had shrunk to a mere 18. And the name Questus is not among them. Perhaps it's a throwback to earlier times. In any case, it's another mystery in this tale of so many mysteries, thus, taking up Poe's own interest, but also signaling that it's a mystery, a narrative of a mystery, and one of the central mysteries is Ovid's exile. So here we can see Sforzeschi signaling the fictional nature of his narrative, his imaginative response to the world of Roman antiquity, and the generic alignments of his narrative with both mystery and quest. Although damaged, we learn that the papyrus scroll can still be read, and it draws a detailed picture of the childhood, coming of age, and adult career of the author. At the start, Questus is 19, an aspiring inventor, like Daedalus perhaps, who would like to create marvelous new machines for the imperial army. His father is a remote figure, a military commander who is usually away on campaign. His mother, however, is anything but remote. Young and beautiful, she's a favorite of the emperor and of the poet Ovid, whom Questus, as a child, called Uncle Ovid. Ovid's Ars Amatoria has just been published, and the young diarist and his friends scrutinize it for sexual secrets, hidden meanings, and scandal. Slowly, Questus realizes that one of those secrets involves his own mother, Aemilia Proculea, around whom his earliest memories revolve. His father, Gaius Firmus Siculus, is staunchly loyal, firmly loyal, one might say, to the Emperor Augustus, and well remunerated for his loyalty. The high points of his career included appointment as a governor of an imperial province and the conduct of a secret imperial mission in Egypt. He wants his son to follow in a military and political career, but Questus, like Ovid, rejects this path, though Sforzeschi's hero does so to pursue his technical engineering interests rather than to pursue a poetic career. After the death of the senior Firmus Siculus, his beautiful widow remarries in accordance with Augustan marital legislation, a subtext throughout the novel. Sforzeschi's humor is on full display in his portrait of Proculea's second husband, her long-standing admirer, the wealthy senator Spurius Caecina Ventro. Poe, Patrick Oliver Enfield, offers prosopographical commentary that illuminates the significance of the senator's praenomen, Spurius. We find no mention of him in historical sources, but we know of the existence of his cousin Aulus, legate in Moesia. Questus' narrative itself lays bare the meaning of Caecina's cognomen, his third name, Ventro, for the Latinless reader. And I have some of this on the slide. Scroll 1, fragment 8. Caecina would just sit there, his hands folded over his belly. Scroll 1, fragment 12. Somebody sat motionless. We can figure out who it is, except for mindlessly rocking his folded fingers up and down on his fat belly. And of course, venter means belly in Latin. In the scrolls, a major focus of Questus' memoir is the elusive figure of the poet Ovid, whom we meet in the recollections of a range of characters. We first see him, unnamed, amongst Questus' earliest memories, visiting often and bringing toys. Later, Questus sees him as a model for his own lack of interest in a conventional upper-class Roman career. Questus and his best friend Quintus on vacation in Baiae, an ancient resort town that was notorious for sexual scandal in antiquity. So they're on vacation there. They sneak off to the baths to read some newly published love poems by Ovid. And Quintus tells Questus some scandalous gossip. In the forum, whispered Quintus, they talk about the emperor doing it with your uncle Ovid's first wife, Ricilia. That was why he divorced her, because the story got back to him. Of course, he couldn't very well put that in a poem. And in his latest work, he is the one doing the cuckolding. Really? Cuckolding the emperor? I asked. Quintus glanced around nervously, and the passage really captures very well the clash between the gilded court poetry of the kind that Ovid writes and the stricter morals that Augustus is trying to impose. An interview with Augustus himself somewhat later confirms the emperor's opposition to a career in poetry and implies an antipathy between Ovid and the emperor. Father started writing, complaining about me. After just a year of the Tyrrhenium, I refused to continue with the Cursum Honorum, etc., etc. Jupiter only knew what I intended to do with my life. It was a time-honored tradition in our family, he said, for the firstborn son to follow in his father's footsteps. Never before had there been a firstborn, not to mention an only son, who'd refused to do so. No such black sheep had ever existed in all our kin, as far back as memory reaches, blah, blah, blah. He was scowling and looking at Proculaea as he spoke, but my mother was staring straight ahead. I was struck again by her resemblance to a white marble Aphrodite. And then when we come back from our missing lines, someone is asking Questus if he wants to write poetry too. No, I don't, I shook my head. Well, said the emperor, rising from his chair. We stood too. Obey your father, Questus, he said peremptorily. You are young and healthy, and luckily you don't write poetry. Well, why should Questus write poetry? Apparently because his mother is a poetry lover. I was simply primus inter pares in the ranks of my mother's admirers. She was a true Roman matron. Lovely and smiling, she kept her ardent entourage laughing at her witty remarks and admiring the lines of poetry she recited. Poetry I wasn't familiar with, which made me feel rather ignorant, but that was all. She was a paragon of chastity. Augustus would have pointed to her as his example when he proclaimed his law against adultery. As you can see, Questus is at first blind to the implications of his mother's predilection for wit and witty verses. But later in the narrative, as he lies wounded in a military hospital after his first and only military engagement, he recalls a conversation with his first mistress, a slave named Cynthia, which is the name of one of the elegiac mistresses in the contemporary Latin corpus, which causes him to rethink his lineage. I suddenly remember Cynthia's face as she entertained me with a story about the emperor. Will you marry again? He had asked Ovid, and the poet, frowning, cast him a glance so peevish that it bordered on extreme disrespect for his majesty. By now, Cynthia was giggling. Augustus likes to pretend he's the mildest of men, but he can be very malicious, she said. He quickly turned to Proculaea and asked in an innocent voice, and how is your baby doing, Aemilia? Ovid was turning purple, a nice senatorial shade of purple. Proculaea raised her head defiantly and, wait, Questus, I interrupted her. I don't get it. Where's the malice in that? Why, Augustus was pretending not to know about his marital predicament, said Cynthia. And suddenly her face turned red. What predicament? Ovid divorced Ricilia a long time ago, and he hasn't remarried. Why is it malicious to mention that? You mean you don't know? Cynthia looked embarrassed, but also astonished. Don't know what? Just then, footsteps sounded from outside. Father was returning from the Senate. Tell me. But Cynthia had jumped up and was leaving my bedroom in a hurry, throwing her stola over her naked body as she went. And that's quite funny too, because for the classicists on the call, that's it's sort of, it's a little like Amores 1.5 and Amores 3.7, where the girlfriend leaves the room in a hurry. Now, thinking back, it all suddenly fell into place. Could she possibly have meant, no, total nonsense. But then another memory swam up out of the hazy tide of my thoughts. Quintus and I were in the pool at Baiae reading Ovid's dirty poems, and I asked him, blah, blah, blah. So Quintus' belated realization of his true parentage comes just before he learns of his nominal father's death and his uncle Ovid's exile. I never knew that, I said. Valerius seemed to hide a smile. There's a lot you don't know about your father. I didn't care. I shrugged. But Vernius' letter contains more sad news. Augustus has banished Ovid to exile. Why? I was aghast. This news upset me far more than the word of my father's passing. Exile was a heavy punishment, and Ovid would be miserable anywhere but Rome. What was his crime? Questus' reaction confirms his affective tie to the poet, but he misreads the source of his mother's grief, as becomes clear in the following scroll. On the way to Rome, the memory of my mother's sudden exclamation came to me over and over. With something like passion, she cried out, "He's taking revenge on him," then stopped herself and refused to say any more. On a later visit to his mother, by now married to Caecina, Questus learns that she has gone to the emperor to intercede on Ovid's behalf. Later still, Questus attends a symposium hosted by his friend Quintus' uncle, Brutus, a name clearly bespeaking the principle of freedom of speech, because Brutus was a tyrant killer in ancient Rome. So he attends this symposium, and Brutus circulates the 12th epistle from our friend on the Pontic shore, a small book. Turns out to be Tristia too. And the guests debate the import of the verses in terms remarkably close to contemporary critical discussion of Ovid's Tristia. It was a lament, the latest of a series. And then there's some quotations which I've put in and which in fact Scorazzi puts in italics. Books, my unlucky obsession. Why do I stay with you when it was my own talent brought me down? And on, not just a mere elegy, but an entire book. I was barely halfway through it when Curtius put down his scroll and wiped a tear from his eye. He is demeaning himself, he declared. But in that backwoods, demeaning, Brutus interjected sarcastically. I say he's looking for a thrashing. I looked over at our host in surprise. Then we have the paprological humor of missing lines. She deserved no other husband. Without her, a bachelor existence should have been yours. Whom else could you have married? After reading this, Brutus looked around as if expecting us to agree with him. And this is supposed to appeal to the divine Augustus? We were silent. I found nothing in the verse to offend the emperor, but of course, the way it is, it says nothing, said Carus. He was well known as the most muscular of Rome's poets, but also so dense that you had to repeat a funny story to him 3 times over, and then count up to 100 before he got the point. Affecting surprise, Brutus asked, "You mean you don't know how it was with the emperor and the empress?" I started counting, and this time Carus caught on by the time I reached 23. Oh, that. Yes, of course I know. Blah, blah, blah. You may be right, Brutus. Augustus is hardly likely to approve, particularly in the context of a line that comes a little further on. Brutus picked up the scroll and began to recite the words. He had studied Ovid's poem closely. Maybe he even knew it by heart. I wasn't surprised. Brutus was an avid reader of poetry, and for that matter, had edited Ovid. 5 words missing. A temple, yet the girl with a gift for indulging her vice should be kept away from there too. Jove's shrine is sure to remind her just how many girls Jove put in the family way. Brutus laid significant emphasis on the word Jove, which was usually a way of praising Augustus to compare him to Jove. Carus looked blank. Curtius got it, but looked sad. So the passage raises the question, should we read Ovid's exile poetry as straightforward encomium or as subversive criticism? Skoretsky points to the latter, like many of Ovid's contemporary scholarly interpreters. Skoretsky himself was a writer in exile, and his sympathy for the exiled Ovid leads him to craft a false death for Ovid in Thomas in the tradition of ancient romance. A local official hints at his relocation to Vindobona, Vienna, where the Roman governor Papias Sabinus recommends to Questus that he see a comedy called The Faithful Husband. by a popular playwright he's never heard of, who's implied to be our exiled poet. Unfortunately, the playwright is recognized in the audience by his nemesis, Ibis. And so Papias and Questus have to devise another haven for the exiled poet. Poe, our friend Patrick Oliver Enfield, deduces from clues in scroll 5 that Papias chose Britain as the unfortunate poet's final destination. The embedded narrative ends, however, not with Ovid's continuing exile, but with Questus' self-exile in command of a ship traveling in the Americas. So Questus, like Daedalus and Icarus, gets out of his own context, so not Crete in this case, but Italy. Questus' fascination with all things mechanical is clear from the outset, as the second fragment of the first scroll focuses on a mechanical device, a child's toy, which he likens to the wings of Icarus. With this image, Skvoretsky takes up most clearly one of the leitmotifs not only of Ovid's exile poetry, but also of his art of love. But this image he transforms into one of life and hope rather than death and the final end and grief, right, for Icarus. For this is the device that Questus adapts into a propeller for his marvelous steamship, which takes him all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Latin America and then south, following in the wake of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket and Jules Verne's sequel to Poe's original novel, The Sphinx de Glace, in which Verne provides realistic scientific explanations for all the inexplicable mysteries in Poe's text. Our last glimpse of Questus is of the remains of our intrepid Roman hero beside Pym's frozen corpse. So in this really wonderful novel, which I recommend to everyone here as well, Skvoretsky explores the themes of art and love, transformation and invention, exile and hope, blurring fiction with historical fact to suggest that history is always already fictional, its essence ungraspable. He adapts in different ways the perennially fascinating questions of sexual desire and personal agency, the politics of literature, and the poetics of exile. Indeed, his novel feels remarkably contemporary in its depiction of interpersonal relationships and their competing perspectives, with allowance made for female agency within an androcentric narrative that is part coming of age story, Bildungsroman, and part adventure story, like the Odyssey. Of course, the novel holds a special appeal for classicists in its thematization of fragmentary evidence in the scholarly pursuit of the poet Ovid. Yet beyond classical studies, Skvoretsky's novel also draws particular attention to ethnocultural difference as encountered by the displaced representatives of Roman or European imperialism. The alienated, homeless figure of the lover, Ovid in exile, furnishes a compelling vehicle for critical global issues of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. And we have questions from our audience, our listening audience about this and this novel integration of Ovid themes and sub-themes.
I'm just going to say how fertile I think Skvoretsky's imagination is, but I also think it's such a telling response to Ovid and the fertility of his imagination and creativity, right? And his rewriting and reworking of the myths that I think have been of so much interest to artists in working in every medium since antiquity to explore, like you guys.
Yes. And have you been reading several novels that borrow from Ovid or comment on Ovid? Is this a preoccupation of your search and your zeal?
Yes, you could say it's, I could say it's part of my professional responsibility to do this, but of course it's also sort of a subgenre of fiction. There have been a lot of Ovidian novels written in the last, I don't know, less than 50 years. It's really extraordinary how popular the theme is. The mystery of his exile is obviously very interesting and exciting, and its connection to the art of love and sexual scandal is also very interesting, along with the possibility of political scandal at the same time. So there are, in fact, I don't know, there's 5 or 6 novels that I've read and tried to think about that take up different ends of the story of Ovid, but all of which also respond to his poetry and the thematics and imagery of his poetry in different ways. There remains an Ovidian vogue across the arts, poetry, music, the plastic arts. Even still, there was a big exhibit in the Tate Modern in which contemporary artists were invited to respond to myths from the Metamorphoses and their artistic heritage. Do you remember when this was, Maria Pia or Darcy? I mean, it was really, it was very recently, 10 years ago, something like that.
In the retelling of Greek myths, we cite Ovid a lot, but there were others who did so. And I was first under the impression, since I'm a novice in this kind of thing, that if I was reading a retelling, it must be Ovid's, but that's not true. Can you give us a bit of a guide, Fodor's guide, a travel guide to retelling of Greek myths by Romans?
Sure. I mean, Greek myth is the earliest subject of Roman poetry in Latin that we have, and it remains very popular. Ovid actually told a bunch of many very obscure myths, but because he told them, they've been canonized and they've become so well known, he would have been astonished at how well known they all are. He has a real preference for non-canonical, off the beaten path myths. He also retells a lot of Greek tragic myths that are very, well, dramatic, right, exciting, and provoke intense emotion, I think, in the reader. And one of the things that we can chart, and I've tried to do some charting of myself, is the reception of Ovid's Metamorphoses in the first 100 years at Rome sort of displaces other versions of those Greek myths, so that whatever his version of the story was becomes canonical in Rome. And that's what's passed on through the Middle Ages, right, to early modern Europe and the West. And so those stories become the canonical forms, even though then, we have access to the Greek myths themselves, right, in the Renaissance, as Greek starts to be published. And people see that there were a whole range of different ways of telling these stories, but Ovid's version won out in the end. Hooray for Ovid, yeah.
Yes.
Ovid.
Terrific. Well, if there are no further questions or comments, I wouldn't mind stepping forward now to be seen and heard. So my name is Daryl Edwards, and I'm Associate Professor of Voice Studies here at the University of Toronto, and I teach artist citizens who sing. And I'm also the Artistic Director and Chair for the Center for Opera Studies in Italy, and for the Center for Opera Studies and Appreciation, or COSA Canada. I was gifted with a 35-centimeter statue of Ovid, which I have in the southwest corner of my Lower West Village living room. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But my musical training is from Western University and from the University of Michigan, and lots of performances and concerts as a tenor. But I want to also say that my last public performance was as a conductor of Mozart's setting of Apollo at Hyacinthus on March 11th, 2020. So isn't it interesting that we're talking about this now? And Ovid was the center of what I last performed. So I'd like to continue now with my share screen. And Here it is. And I thought I'd call this The Art of Love at First Sight. And I enjoy wordplay, but I was particularly pleased with this one because it just came up all of a sudden, and how this Ovid opera began. And I would like you to know what this tenor and the Ovid statue have in common. This would have been a better picture, but I just took it spontaneously last night. Okay, so I could have been better shaven, etc. But as you can see, I do look up to Ovid. And this is the statue that I was gifted, and it's a likeness of the statue that is in Sulmona, which brings Sulmona to the next center of what I'm speaking. And it's somewhat parallel to Rome, but one of the great things about it is that it's only 45 minutes away from the Adriatic Sea in Pescara, which is a great source of entertainment and relief during our work in Italy. So in 2007, we began the Center for Opera Studies in Italy in Sulmona because it was near the hometown of a very generous donor. And they wanted to help to teach and impart Italian heritage to their children and grandchildren who were not retaining it, and wanted to help them learn the language, know the culture. And so the creation of the Bel Canto Foundation for the Advancement of Italian Canadian Heritage in Opera happened, and they like to be known as the Bel Canto Foundation. And I've just put up a couple of pictures here for you to see that here we have a Baroque ensemble with several lutanists and gamba players and a harpsichordist performing Monteverdi's Coronation of Poppaea. And the two singers here are Emily D'Angelo and Caitlin Wood. Emily D'Angelo went on probably about 5 years later, it wasn't much after that, to win the Metropolitan Opera competition and win first place in several other competitions. She's now a spokesperson model for Rolex watches. So she's done very well. And this last month, she was featured as an artist on Deutsche Grammophon. And Caitlin Wood is now a national, international soprano singing wonderful light soprano roles. But this is the kind of roles that they first started out in. And her first role at COSI, Emily D'Angelo, went on to premiere for her at the Metropolitan Opera in the same role that she first performed in her first opera role at COSI. So the whole Center for Opera Studies in Italy and its intention really found its home. And here's a production of La Bohème in the City Hall courtyard of Sulmona. And you can see it's very much a community connection kind of experience with a non-Baroque COSI festival orchestra here. I have to say in this production, Mimi, as she usually dies, in our production, she died also. So just so you feel comfortable that we're keeping up tradition. We got excited about the birthplace of Ovid. This is the Ovid statue, for which I own a replica. And this is not in the piazza, the main piazza, but in the September 20th square in Sulmona. And to prepare for 2017's Ovidiana celebration, there was a call for proposals about celebrating the 2 millennium anniversary. We were told by the head or the local minister of culture and tourism that COSI was now bringing in the equal amount of tourism dollars to the local giostra, the medieval giostra that they have annually in Sulmona at the end of July and beginning of August. So we were feeling quite confident in making a proposal that we might get some funding for holding an opera festival dedicated to Ovid, because we have not only Apollo and Hyacinth, we have Orfeo and Eurydice by Gluck, and operas by Cavalli. And so we made the proposal, and what we didn't fully realize, but we certainly do now, is the proprietary nature of Italians for their own communities and for their own artists. So, and for their own voters. So the great amount of funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars that were made available, were divvied up amongst the members of the granting committee and their own organizations. And one of the greatest things to achieve in these committees is to get on them. Because if you get on a committee, you can look after your own. So we were not successful in reaching that zenith goal of bringing all these funded operas to Sulmona. But what it did do was give us pathways for new ways of doing it. And it really enabled the creation of COSA Canada for the people who have been to Sulmona, and lots of people who could not afford to go or could not travel to become locally involved in the entire culture of opera and beyond its Italian roots. So not only was the Art of Love carried forth in this manner, but other projects were too, which you will see. And this is one of them. Dean Bury's Giudizio di Pygmalione has appeared in workshop form, and it's how Pygmalion receives his just rewards. And also, here's a picture of the house concert that I last conducted in March of 2020, and a reworking of Mozart's Apollo and Hyacinth, which is a fabulous work for young audiences today. Here is a photo credit, because I didn't want to take a microbial scientist's photo credit away. This one's in public domain, and that's a picture of the nasty COVID bug that you have seen on the news reports. But anything that the ability to reimagine and reboot and reconcile and rebuild opera outside of European or Eurocentric beginnings has been given to us. And we decided, as we all are now in opera, learning to discover how opera can look like all of us, because it really should. And we need to find the universal. What are we all doing together? And what traits and characteristics do we all share that are both, that are chiaroscuro, that are dark and light? So rebuilding opera has been our preoccupation, rather than just trotting out the traditional misogynistic memes of Tosca or Madama Butterfly. Here, it helped us to launch our national auditions for COSA Canada, where we thought, not only can we do things in Toronto, we can take all of this online. And even though it will be inconvenient and we can't hear each other singing simultaneously on online, we can work together and create works of art, and to make opera that makes a difference. So I gathered together a group of colleagues who are highly skilled opera artists and opera educators. So we have here Marion Newman, who's an Indigenous mezzo-soprano, and now is a host for Saturday Afternoon at the Opera on CBC. She's a former voice student of mine and makes a tremendous difference in our awareness and reconciliation. Dr. Vicky St. Pierre is now Dean of Arts at Mount Allison University and is an advocate for LGBTQ issues and for the integration of LGBTQ singers and artists in the art form for those who feel marginalized or kept out. And we have Acadian Nathalie Doucet, who until this past month was on faculty at the Conservatory in Amsterdam and is now head of music at Michigan Opera Theatre in Detroit. Stuart Barker, who is the director and head of production for British Youth Opera. Professor Patrick Raftery and Metropolitan Opera veteran, who also sang alongside on stage with Dame Joan Sutherland and Luciano Pavarotti. If I was going to have a claim to fame, I wouldn't mind having that one. Professor at University of British Columbia. This is my doctoral student, Morgan Reed, who has done a tremendous amount of bringing together of people and administrative details. Professor Lisa Roy from L'Université de Moncton, and singing professor, the resident conductor of Vancouver Opera, Leslie Dalla, assistant conductor at the Metropolitan Opera, Howard Watkins, and assistant professor at Dalhousie University, who is co-director of voice at the university, and in Quebec, Frank Mucha, who is head of voice at McGill University Conservatory. So opera that looks like us. We started with the representation of all of this so that people would know, young artists would know it was a safe place, that they would be seen and they could be appreciated in their auditions. The concern of the artisans or the singers as they got into it, they wanted no part of ecclesiastical Latin, since that's the most common Latin that they all know, to be used in this production, which is something that probably Augustus would have agreed upon had he been dealing with that kind of thing in those days, not to use liturgical Latin in this profane work. So that was easier said than done, because if you are strongly habituated in singing veni instead of veni, and preceptor instead of precator, or whatever it is that you mentioned, Maria Pia, it was learning a whole new dialect. And it caused some of the singers not to continue with the opera because they thought, oh no, I didn't sign up for all of this. I thought I was just going to sing my Kyrie eleison, even though that's Greek, but credo in unum Deum, right? So some of them said, okay, Roman Latin, I'm out. And others wanted to make sure that if they were to be involved in the production, that the inferences of cosmetics could only be used for clarification or of beauty and not the supremacy of whiteness. And the young singers were quite horrified to think that it might have any other connotation. So they wanted me to make sure that was clear. Here we are in our rehearsals. And as you can see, we had many, many rehearsals, and these are just the ones that I did. There were also the rehearsals with the dramatic director because the animation was done, but the videos of the singers were made after they had made the recordings of their singing. So they are, what is often done these days, they are lip syncing. But I want you to know that no auto-tuning was used in the making of this opera. All of the singers are singing on pitch at original pitch, and they have had to use no help to get themselves up to the right key. Okay, that's a bit of a joke because it would be absurd to think otherwise. But they did make their video and their audio at 2 different times and had to submit them at 2 different times. And it was quite an involved process. The cast metamorphoses, I hope you don't mind that I stole that. There were about 8 singers who began who didn't conclude. And as in any performance study or research study, I wanted to let you know what the reasons were. And I was a bit concerned at first because those who didn't continue were ones for whom English was not their first language, or they were singing in the chorus roles, and I didn't want some other non-intended reason of us doing this kind of repertoire to be the reason for them bowing out, because they felt they were on the outside looking in. But these were the reasons, and some good things came of it. Some had commitment overwhelm. One person had done so many summer programs, they had sung themselves out and couldn't sing one more thing. La mia voce, la mia voce. They had illness. Oh, there's a mistake. I left out an L. I hope that doesn't mean you'll cancel me now because I made a spelling error. Anyway, they were not interested in singing the choruses too, only the leading roles. That's not uncommon, but it only happened to a couple of people. Some had mental and economic hardships because with the pandemic, they became the sole breadwinner for their extended family. And others just said they weren't continuing. Mentorship opportunities came out of this because I was able to call people I could rely on who would step forward and who were eager to be seen at this time, just to have an opportunity to make art and to keep their performance chops in shape. And so some of these were Sydney Bedke, who has just signed on to Canada's greatest artist management company, Dean Artist, and then Ryan Downey, who recently was in the Vancouver Opera Young Artist Program, and a full-time opera singer who was home for a hiatus, Alexander Hayek, who was a house baritone at the Dresden Semperoper and also at Gießen Stadttheater in Germany. So the singers who were full-time professionals had a great effect on those who were learning professional training. There were many sleepless nights by the part of a few of the people involved. The animator, Sean Stanley, and the audio engineer, Wesley Huey. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. I'm thinking how I would see it. Wesley Hoy, and the audio and video editing of Elizabeth Legierski. And then there's the work that Morgan Reed did to it. I would imagine it's like someone putting a book together, trying to get the contributors of chapters to get their chapters in because they were begging, pleading, and highly coercing singers to get their audio and video recordings in. You will notice that one singer recorded their audio, but did not get their video in by the deadline. So if you hear a voice that has no picture, that was the person. That's the chapter that doesn't appear in the book. In this production team, I'd like to acknowledge the great work of Sean Stanley, for whom I said, you know, since you do animation and you are the partner of one of the singers in the show, is there any way that you might animate part or this story, since we have to reimagine what we're doing? And he said, yes, I could do that. And I said, it doesn't have to be like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. I'm thinking more like the Monty Python figures that just move marginally and their mouths don't move. Maybe when the singer is singing, they can be lit up with a bit of a glow. And that's what Sean Stanley did, and how. So, and then I said, no singer is wanting to be singing but not seeing. So every singer who's singing and who submitted a video is appearing at the bottom of the screen. And so you get the full effect without all the extra opera film production that's required. And so here's our video editor and our sound engineer. Both Elizabeth and Wes are performers in the opera as well. And through the miracle of technology over the airwaves, Helen Beckey has since the beginning of the opera moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where she and her husband are on faculty at the University of Arkansas. So she sent the piano tracks to the opera. Up here, she completed them. Our production manager, Morgan Reed, the director, who helped the students or the young artists to animate what they were doing on screen. And I got this picture of Ovid. When he agreed to have his pictures used, he said he doesn't want to appear stoned, but he relented anyway, because he thought he might not get the attention. I'm sorry for this cheap humor to all of you Ovid specialists. And our composer, and who also chose the specific texts for this opera, Norbert Palej. And the original idea in speaking with Norbert was that he would come to see the premiere and they would enjoy this rolling out in Sulmona. Well, that hasn't happened yet. And but what we do have is the but it didn't happen, but look what we do have. This is a picture of Norbert when we decided, we were getting things together and we were ramping up, and I called him and he returned my call, and he said he was crossing Canada to get to his in-laws in Calgary. And he said, greetings from Mussolini. And I said, Norbert, this is epic. We've got to include this in our retelling of how this opera was made. So please send me a picture of you with your bike. And notice it's, speaking of traditions, it's a Harley Davidson. So I'm very impressed. And I'll finish with this crest of, this is the crest of Sulmona, and it quotes in an anagram, Sulmo mia patria est. Sulmona is my country. And it is this place that has given birth to not only all of his great work, but has given birth to this opera and this symposium, and this my tremendous privilege of meeting new colleagues and having the partial sponsorship of the Jackman Humanities Institute. So I am very grateful, and I thank you very much for your attention and ask you for any questions you might have. Thank you for your applause. Do you have any questions or queries? I can also tell you that composer Andrew Ager composed 4 songs set to Ovid texts, which I premiered in Sulmona a few years ago. And I'm hoping in the next year or so to get those recorded. And then they can be added to the collection of Ovidiana. I don't know where that would go other than on YouTube or Spotify, but I'm sure once they're done, I'll let Alice and Keith know, so you can have an Ovid party and cheer on all the terrible things that were set to music from Ovid's musings.
So
Yes.
can I just ask you when we're all going to convene in Sulmona again? When do you predict that will be?
Well, we will be going back there this summer. I would really like to plan a multimedia, semi-stage, half oratorio, half opera version of The Art of Love next summer. So that would be 2023. And you and I, Allison, will be speaking about how we might augment that with some scholarly happenings. And since Maria Pia has never been, that has to be remedied because it's just wrong. It's just wrong. Okay. Is that a sufficient answer? Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I would be interested to know if I've made any terrible mistakes. I did notice that I did not soften the S in Ars Amatoria, and I should have. So it's Ars Amatoria. I'm so sorry. Okay. Now I would like to introduce the composer of this opera, and I talked to Norbert after hearing some of his songs that were being performed by some of my students, and I thought, what a lyric gift my colleague has. I'm going to ask him if he would like to compose on works of Ovid. And that's how this first magnetized us initially. So as I welcome Norbert, I will say that he's Associate Professor and Head of Composition at the University of Toronto Faculty of Music, as well as Artistic Director of the U of T New Music Festival. His music has been internationally performed with recent premieres at Carnegie Hall and at the Dubai Expo 2020. And his new composition, Return from the Stars, was developed in collaboration with the International Space Station and introduced from space by European Space Agency astronaut Thomas Pesquet, or Pesquet. Originally from Poland, Norbert Palej holds degrees from the New England Conservatory, the Juilliard School, and Cornell University. He loves writing opera. Thank you very much, Norbert Palej. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for your talk. Actually, it was so interesting for me to hear about all these things that were sort of happening backstage. because due to the pandemic that separated us for so long, and this whole period when this opera was being developed, we didn't see each other. So there was this very unusual, untypical disconnectedness between the composer and the performers. It was literally quite the situation where I handed Daryl the score at some point when it was finished. He took it. We had a little bit of conversation here and there, but mostly it was just happening. And only a few days ago, I kind of received the final product, and it was a lot of suspense. I didn't know what to expect and how all this would come together. But I must admit, I'm just still in awe of the kind of work that Daryl has accomplished, bringing all these artists together, all this young talent, and for everybody to collaborate and to create this. I mean, it was just brought tears to my eyes when I first heard this, just to see all this creativity and talent coming together. It's just amazing. And I'm so glad that that my opera kind of became the object that brought all this, that collided all these forces. So that's really wonderful. Thank you, Daryl. And so it all started several years ago when Daryl approached me with this idea about writing opera that's somehow devoted to Ovid or commemorates Ovid. I just came from writing another piece that was based on a text by Ovid. It's entitled "The Demise of Argus Panoptes," and it was based on a passage from the Metamorphoses by Ovid. And it was also a vocal piece, but it was just several voices and piano. But it was a very important piece for me. Somehow it transformed me as an artist. It opened up kind of new dimensions in my thinking about music. And part of it, I think, had to do with encounter with the poetry of Ovid, which somehow spoke deeply to me. But also just with the language, setting Latin. I haven't done that before, and I loved it. And it was different than setting any of the previous languages I have worked with. I think with Latin itself, with the language, it's that, on one hand, it's the sound of Latin, it's a beautiful language, very much like Italian. It has all these open vowels and very crisp consonants, so it's a great language for singing, obviously. It's also a language that has this such deep roots, and it's connected to so many other languages that in a way, even if you don't speak Latin, you can still listen and you will get something out of it just through association, through association with different words from languages that you might know. But from a composer's point of view, there is also setting Latin, because it's a dead language and nobody speaks it. I don't speak it. I understand it because I studied it in high school, but I don't speak it. It's actually quite liberating to set it, I find, in that as a composer, when you set a text, it has a way of kind of capturing you and kidnapping you in a way. Like it guides you where the language wants to go, where the words want to go. And that's dangerous because I think, music and literature, they connect, but they really operate on very different dimensions. And you can't just kind of translate one into another easily. But somehow working with Latin created this wonderful sense of liberty where the language was just enough inflaming my imagination, but wasn't kind of forcing me to go in any particular direction. I actually could just write music, and I felt free to do it. So I immediately had this idea. I want to set Latin, because I think at the beginning when Daryl and I talked, we didn't decide that it would have to be Latin. It just had to be something to do with Ovid, but I thought I want to set Latin and I want to set Ovid. But the problem, of course, is there is nothing by Ovid that's actually dramatic. So what I did is I went through all of Ovid's writings, and I highlighted those passages or those kind of episodes that seemed dramatic to me, that somehow had characters appearing who had different roles, and they were interacting somehow. These characters didn't really have to say anything specifically. They didn't need to be quoted saying this or that, but as long as they appeared and performed a certain action, that to me was dramatic. And so I was working with a whole myriad of different excerpts and trying to then find a thematic link, something that like an overarching idea that would govern this. And eventually I decided on an opera that would consist of 2 acts with an interlude in the middle. The first act is essentially a comedy, and it's based on the art of facial cosmetics, or as sometimes it's called, art of beauty. And here the main topic is that which is superficial, the kind of the appearance, it's lighthearted, it's bright, and then we have an interlude which is based on a text that's attributed to Ovid. It's called Somnium, or Dream, and here is where things start getting ominous and somehow going into a darker direction. It's in some ways the interlude prophesizes certain things that will happen in the second act. Here also there's a theme of love, but something is going wrong with the love, and there are hints of adultery, and it's this. It's like a strange dream, and maybe the less said about it, the better, because in some ways music operates on the kind of on the level of mystery. So I leave the interpretation up to the listener. And then the second act is a tragedy, and it consists of 3 vignettes, 3 different tales, which all have to do with Crete, and I called them Tales from Crete. And here things gradually get worse and worse, and more tragic and more tragic. First we have the tale of Parsifal, who was mythological queen of Crete, and who fell in love with, as was said before, fell in love with a bull, and so something goes strangely wrong with love here, and she also alters her appearance. She has this contraption built for her by Daedalus that makes her look like a cow, and this so there's this theme of external, the internal, like what's real, what's not real, who do we pretend to be versus who we are, and then the second tale from Crete is it depicts Ariadne, who is the daughter of Parsifal, and Ariadne was she helped Theseus, who wanted to defeat to kill the Minotaur. Who was the Minotaur was the child of Parsifal and that bull, and he was an abomination and a monster. So Theseus decided to kill him, and Ariadne helped him in this endeavor. And then he was to come back to her, but instead he deserted her. He basically stood her up, and she was devastated by this. And she was waiting for him on Naxos, and in this opera we find her on the shores of Naxos crying. Her beauty, her external beauty, whatever that may be, was at this, it was devastated through sadness, through the circumstances of her life. And that's just at that moment the god Bacchus appears and sort of snatches her up, and she becomes the wife of a god. And then the final tale is of Daedalus and Icarus, and that is yet another look at love. And this is the love that's in a way the purest of love that can be, which is, or one of the purest forms of love, which is parental love. Daedalus loses his son, whom he loves, and his son, meanwhile, by trying to become, by wearing an outfit that makes him like a bird, he goes too far with this, in that he starts believing to have the power of a bird, and he, through this folly, that's his downfall. So again, we have someone who tries to be something that he is not, so that the external is not in accordance with the internal. Overall, we have this progression from this it's a, as love gets deeper, it also becomes more tragic in the course of the whole opera. And at the beginning, so when I was imagining this opera being performed, I knew that these characters that appear here are not sort of flesh and blood people. They're more like stereotypes or archetypes. And I even had this idea that if this were performed live, the singers could perhaps wear masks, and the same singers could even appear in different roles and switch masks, so that there would be this connection between them, almost like they're different aspects of each other, but also there will be something impersonal about them, like they are larger than life. And it's kind of amazing how in the animation that Sean Stanley has created for this, and we didn't really talk about this, he just kind of intuited this, I guess. It really comes across that way, because we have these characters that they don't have facial expressions, they're just kind of static. And I think it actually works perfectly with the music and what the music is trying to accomplish here. I was at the time when I was writing this music, and actually still now, I was fascinated with a style in the visual arts which is called the naïve style of painting, and specifically with a Polish artist whose name was Nikifor. Actually, he was not Polish; he was Lemko, but he lived in Poland. He was an amazing guy. He was actually homeless, completely unschooled, but he created these paintings or drawings, which he did on whatever he could find, on matchboxes, on cardboard. He would draw, and there's this amazing kind of simplicity in his artwork, and in a way a naivete, but they're just beautiful. The colors are beautiful. They have a kind of a very direct expression, and it intrigued me, and especially when applied to music. I personally I just became. I love opera, and I particularly like opera. Of Mozart. I love Rossini, I love Puccini. Somehow in the 20th century, as much as I love the 20th century music, obviously this is the music that I grow out of, I have found that opera, I never liked 20th century opera. I thought or at least, very few things there that I like. And a lot of it, I found that it takes itself too seriously, and more importantly, that it loses what to me is kind of an essential element of opera, which is melody, just melodic lyricism and melodic beauty. And I just wanted to bring that back. I wanted it to be really a piece of music that can be enjoyed, where we can remember the melodies. We can. They kind of can live with us even after we finish listening to the opera. So my goal here was to write in a musical style that had that kind of simplicity, a kind of a classic character. And the classicism of it is a kind of a combination of elements of the classical musical style like Mozart or something along those lines, but also what I imagined as ancient Greek music or ancient Roman music, this kind of fictional ancient music. And the outcome to me musically, I wanted something that's mysterious, that's a little bit uncanny, that's both amusing and humorous and lighthearted, but also somehow dark and deep on the other end. And which are also elements that I perceived in the Ovid itself, that it is kind of, on the surface at first glance, it seems almost vain or kind of just superficial, but there is always this other element. You feel like he is just making fun of something or he's parodying something, and there are all kinds of dark, deep roots under everything that's there. And I wanted that to be there in the music, so that on the surface it's lighthearted, it has memorable melodies, it doesn't hit the listener over their head with any sort of problems in the initial perception, but that it has depth underneath. That was kind of my objective, and again, I'm just astounded how in this production that Daryl has put together, it miraculously, all these elements seem to collaborate to convey this intention, because Sean's artwork, it has that kind of naive style, and I find it deeply uncanny. You sort of don't know whether you should be laughing or you should be kind of making strange faces, like because weird things are happening there, and it has this wonderful, especially in the dream scene and in the interlude, this kind of transition between reality and the dream, when Ovid is sort of transported into the sky and then becomes part of a vase, of a kind of an ancient Greek vase. It's just it fantastically, I think, encapsulates that kind of spirit that I had in mind when I was writing the music. So yeah, so many things came together here, and it's just so exciting to see it realized. I think that strangely, this virtual presentation, which was necessitated by the pandemic, really worked for this project. Like, it wasn't a kind of a bad compromise where, like, okay, this is, we kind of do it this way because we don't have any other way. No, it was actually Daryl and the whole team of amazing artists that worked on this. They kind of turned it in a way where the weakness becomes the strength. So where that virtual aspect and the fact that it's animated rather than performed live, that actually becomes the strength of this opera, I think, in my view right now. That being said, of course, I very much hope that we will experience a real live production sometime, because I think that will be a whole other level, of course, also of just vocal performance and vocal freedom and enjoyment. And there could be many things there that are really enacted, that of course could not be enacted in this. So I really hope that this plan for 2023 works out and that we can create something there. But for now, as it is today, I am just delighted with this result, and I'm so grateful to everybody who has participated in realizing this. Just so grateful and so blown away by their talent and the amount of work that was poured into it. And also grateful to all of you here for being at the symposium and talking and devoting your time and thoughts to this subject. It's just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norbert. And it's amazing that when given an obstacle, we turned a scar into a star, right?
Yeah.
So it's really great that that happened. And I said to my wife this morning, I will cherish forever the phone call I received yesterday from Norbert. I thought he was going to say, when I made the connection, I thought his first line was going to be, "What the hell have you done to my opera?" But he said the exact opposite. So I was really thrilled. And for the countless hours that people like Faciei and Elizabeth Lakierski and Sean Stanley put into this, they took it as well, and everyone did not only as well as they can, it's made something that's even better than it could have been under these circumstances. So it's a real lesson in outcomes. When you think it's going to be dire, it's delightful. So thank you very much, Norbert. And are you working on an opera right now?
No opera right now, something else, but it also has some vocal elements, but not opera.
Okay. Well, I hope there's another opera in your future. Maybe Art of More Love. Okay,
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, does anyone have any questions for Norbert? Okay. I hope that you will hear something that you will want to hum. I'm thinking of one right now, the Countryman's Chorus. It's really a great rhythm, and I think the Ovid lines are really terrific too. How the heifers are depicted and the satanic or dark figures are also fascinating. What Sean Stanley has done is tremendously vivid. So we'll be, to all of the registrants, we'll have that up online until the end of Sunday midnight, Halloween midnight. And then it will disappear and be released to the public. So Allison, as director of the Jackman Humanities Institute, would you like to give us a benediction of sorts?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Daryl, for initiating, well, both the opera and the Art of Love Symposium associated with the opera premiere. It's very exciting to be involved in this. And I'm very excited to hear that more than the participants in the symposium will have the opportunity to hear the opera in the very near future. I want to thank Darcy Krasny, who's on the call, for suggesting that we try to team up with the International Ovidian Society, of which well, I was a founding member, and Darcy and Maria Pia are intimately involved. And we will definitely get a link to the symposium on the iOS website as well to try and get all kinds of, drum up all kinds of enthusiasm internationally for a premiere in Salmona of the
very good. Very good.
That's right. That's right. And the JHI is proud to have had a small role to play in that great desideratum. So thank you so much, Daryl. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to all the participants who I know have had to come and go. And I know that the really great treat now will be to go and play the opera.
Yes.
So, thank you so much for making that available to us. I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to hear it, Norbert.
Thank you.
And Daryl, yes. So thank you all.
Okay, well, great to meet you, Maria Pia, and great to work with you as well, Allison. I've heard your name forever, and well, not forever. but it's great to work together. And Norbert and I are just on different floors of the same building, but we're of one accord.
That's right.
Good. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Have a great,
Thank you.
happy Halloween weekend. Bye now.
Bye. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.